He's three law firms on retainer. I don't know how much money is coming in, but I know that a lot of money is going out every single month for Diddy.
Another key issue in the case involves the broader cultural environment surrounding hip-hop during the mid-1990s. At that time, rivalries between record labels were often portrayed as personal battles between artists and executives. One of the most widely discussed tensions existed between Suge Knight and Sean Diddy Combs, two powerful figures representing competing sides of the music industry. Knight led Death Row Records, the label that represented Tupac Shakur during the final years of his career. Combs, meanwhile, was the driving force behind Bad Boy Records on the East Coast. Media coverage at the time often framed their rivalry as part of a larger cultural clash between West Coast and East Coast hip-hop. In reality, the relationships between artists, producers, and executives were far more complicated. Many performers collaborated across regional lines despite the headlines suggesting deep divisions. But the perception of rivalry became powerful enough that it influenced how fans and journalists interpreted events. That atmosphere played a significant role in shaping public reaction to Shakur's death. When the shooting occurred, people immediately began searching for connections between the tragedy and the ongoing tension between record labels. The idea that business competition might somehow have contributed to the violence became a persistent theme in media discussions. Decades later, those same assumptions are resurfacing in the courtroom. Because Dwayne Keefe D. Davis once described conversations involving Sean Diddy Combs, the defense is attempting to explore whether industry rivalries influenced the events surrounding the shooting. However, prosecutors are likely to argue that such claims distract from the simpler explanation. Another key issue in the case involves the broader cultural environment surrounding hip-hop during the mid-1990s. At that time, rivalries between record labels were often portrayed as personal battles between artists and executives. One of the most widely discussed tensions existed between Suge Knight and Sean Diddy Combs, two powerful figures representing competing sides of the music industry. Knight led Death Row Records, the label that represented Tupac Shakur during the final years of his career. Combs, meanwhile, was the driving force behind Bad Boy Records on the East Coast. Media coverage at the time often framed their rivalry as part of a larger cultural clash between West Coast and East Coast hip-hop. In reality, the relationship—
Well, I think some of it did have to do with that battery by prisoner case, which he went to trial on and was found guilty. I think in some ways it can be like a sports team. If you come up short, sometimes you need to change the leadership.
Beyond the legal arguments, the case also highlights how cultural memory evolves over time. The death of Tupac Shakur became more than just a criminal investigation. It transformed into a symbol of an era in music history. Fans around the world debated theories about the shooting for decades, turning the case into one of the most discussed mysteries in entertainment. Documentaries, books, and online discussions continued to revisit the events of September 1996. Each new retelling added details, interpretations, and speculation. Over time, these narratives blended together, creating a complicated mix of fact and legend. When Dwayne Keefe D. Davis began speaking publicly about his alleged role in the events, many people believed the mystery had finally been solved. His willingness to discuss the shooting openly made him appear like a rare insider who was finally revealing the truth. However, public storytelling does not follow the same standards as courtroom testimony. In media interviews, individuals may speak loosely or dramatically to capture attention. In court, every statement must withstand cross-examination and legal scrutiny. This difference explains why the upcoming trial is so significant. For the first time, the narratives that have circulated for decades will be tested against strict legal standards. Witnesses will be questioned under oath, and evidence will be evaluated according to established rules of criminal procedure. The process may finally separate confirmed facts from long-standing rumors that have shaped the story for nearly 30 years.
Pac would have boxed him. Pac would have loved to beat his ass in the ring, raise some money, and give it to the hood.
As the trial approaches, legal experts say the case could become one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings connected to the history of hip-hop. The death of Tupac Shakur was not just a tragedy for fans, it was a cultural moment that reshaped the music industry and left a lasting mark on popular culture. Now, nearly 3 decades later, the courtroom may finally provide answers that investigators and fans have sought for years. The prosecution will attempt to show that Dwayne Keefe D. Davis played a direct role in organizing or assisting the attack that killed Shakur. Their case relies heavily on the statements Davis made publicly about the shooting. The defense, meanwhile, will try to dismantle that narrative piece by piece. They argue that Davis's earlier stories were exaggerated accounts influenced by rumor and bravado. According to this strategy, the prosecution has built its case on words that were never intended to function as legal admissions. Another potential turning point could involve the testimony of Sean "Diddy" Combs. If the defense succeeds in bringing him into the courtroom, the trial could expand beyond the events of a single night in Las Vegas and begin examining broader tensions within the music industry during the 1990s. Regardless of how the legal arguments unfold, the case represents a rare opportunity for the justice system to revisit one of the most famous unsolved crimes in entertainment history. For decades, the story of Tupac Shakur's death has existed somewhere between documented investigation and cultural mythology. Now that mythology is being tested against legal standards of evidence and testimony. Witnesses will be questioned, old statements will be examined, and long-standing assumptions will face scrutiny under oath. By the time the trial concludes, the world may finally understand whether the story told for years by Dwayne Keefe D. Davis was a confession hidden in plain sight, or simply a legend that grew too large to escape.
4 years, 2 months in prison.
Wow.
He served a year. He gets some time. He gets 15% credit, so he'd be at 14-ish.
2.5 years.
2 months.
So, and then he gets another 15% in the remaining.
Yeah.
He's out in 2 years.
Yeah. Should have stuck with the original guest.
I know.
One of the biggest challenges facing investigators in the case is the passage of time. Nearly 30 years have passed since the night Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas. Over such a long period, memories fade, witnesses disappear, and physical evidence becomes harder to analyze. Some individuals connected to the events of that night have died. Others have moved on with their lives and may struggle to recall details with precision. Even documents from the original investigation have been revisited multiple times, creating a complex record that prosecutors must now organize for a modern courtroom. Despite these challenges, the case regained momentum in recent years largely because of statements made by Dwayne Keefe D. Davis. Investigators began reviewing those statements carefully, comparing them with older police files and witness accounts. That process eventually led to the decision to bring formal charges against Davis in 2023. Supporters of the prosecution believe that Davis's own words provide a rare glimpse into what actually happened that night. They argue that few people connected to the case have ever spoken as openly about the events. From their perspective, his repeated descriptions offer valuable insight into the planning and execution of the shooting. Critics, however, point out that storytelling can change over time. When someone repeats the same story for decades, details may evolve, intentionally or unintentionally. Small additions made during interviews can slowly transform into widely accepted facts, even if they were never confirmed by independent evidence. That debate is likely to become central during the trial. Jurors will need to decide how much weight to give to statements that were made long after the crime occurred. They must also consider whether those statements were influenced by personal motivations such as reputation, publicity, or financial gain. In many ways, the courtroom will be asked to answer a question that has puzzled observers for years. Did Davis reveal the truth when he spoke about the shooting, or did he simply create a dramatic narrative that eventually caught up with him?
The reason we asked everyone to be here today is obviously we are the new attorneys for Dwayne Davis in the Tupac case. Now set for trial February of next year. The reason in particular that we asked the media to be here is that, obviously we're not trying the case in the media, but we want to establish better relations.
The possibility that Sean "Diddy" Combs could be called to testify has drawn enormous attention from legal analysts and music historians alike. While Combs has never been charged in connection with the killing of Tupac Shakur, his name appeared in several stories told by Dwayne Keefe D. Davis over the years. In those stories, Davis suggested that discussions about eliminating rivals may have occurred during the height of the East Coast-West Coast rivalry. He described alleged conversations involving money and influence within the music industry. These claims were never proven, but they circulated widely because of the intense media attention surrounding the feud. The defense now hopes that testimony from Combs could clarify whether any of those conversations actually occurred. If Combs denies the allegations under oath, the defense may argue that Davis's earlier stories were exaggerated or misunderstood. Prosecutors, however, may attempt to limit the relevance of such testimony. Their case focuses primarily on whether Davis participated in the events that led to the shooting, not on the broader industry rivalry between record labels. Still, the mere possibility of Combs appearing in court could attract global attention to the trial. Few figures from the era remain as influential or recognizable within the music industry. His testimony, if it occurs, could reshape public perception of the case regardless of its direct legal impact. Because of this, both sides must carefully consider the risks and benefits of bringing additional high-profile witnesses into the courtroom.
So she testified, excuse me, that she was Diddy's ex-assistant. She said he her, sexually assaulted her in various ways multiple times. He exacted unbelievable violence against her, threatened her, one point allegedly threatened to take her phone and use anything on the.
Another important element of the case involves the relationships between individuals connected to the shooting. During the mid-1990s, tensions between different groups in the music industry and on the streets of Los Angeles often overlapped. Artists, record executives, and neighborhood alliances sometimes existed within the same social circles. At the center of the events surrounding the death of Tupac Shakur was the powerful presence of Suge Knight, the co-founder of Death Row Records. Knight had a reputation for aggressive business tactics and strong influence within both the music industry and street communities. His close relationship with Shakur made him a central figure in the events leading up to the shooting. The earlier confrontation with Orlando Anderson at the MGM Grand placed those tensions into motion. Investigators have long considered that altercation to be a potential trigger for the later attack on the Las Vegas Strip. According to surveillance footage and witness accounts, Anderson was assaulted by members of Shakur's group shortly before the fatal shooting occurred. When Dwayne Keefe D. Davis later described the incident, he suggested that the fight inside the casino created a chain reaction. In his version of events, Anderson and others associated with him felt humiliated by the confrontation and decided to respond later that evening. This interpretation aligns with a traditional explanation for many street-related conflicts: retaliation. If jurors accept this version of events, the shooting could be seen as a rapid escalation of a personal dispute rather than a carefully organized conspiracy. However, Davis's earlier statements also introduced more complex elements, including discussions of financial motives and rivalries within the music business. Those additions complicate the narrative, suggesting that multiple factors may have influenced what happened that night. Because of this, the trial may explore not only the physical events surrounding the shooting, but also the social and business relationships connecting everyone involved.
We've done 3 others where we've laid out the prosecution case. This time, we're talking specifically, what is Diddy's defense? And we decided to test it with a mock jury, and it is fascinating.
It is absolutely fascinating, keeping in mind that the real jury will be sitting down to do this. The trial starts.
As the case moves forward, the world will be watching closely. The death of Tupac Shakur left a permanent mark on the history of hip-hop and popular culture. For many fans, the unresolved nature of the investigation created a sense that justice had never fully arrived. Now prosecutors believe they have finally identified someone responsible for helping carry out the attack. Their case against Dwayne Keefe D. Davis rests heavily on the statements he shared over the years about the night of the shooting. The defense insists those statements were misunderstood. They argue that Davis was repeating stories influenced by rumor, reputation, and the culture surrounding the events of the 1990s. According to this argument, the prosecution has mistaken storytelling for confession. When the trial begins, jurors will hear evidence from investigators, witnesses, and experts who have spent years examining the case. They will review recordings, documents, and accounts that stretch back nearly 3 decades. The outcome could determine whether the long-running mystery surrounding Tupac Shakur's death finally reaches a legal conclusion. If Davis is convicted, the case will be remembered as the moment when years of speculation turned into courtroom accountability. If he is acquitted, the legend surrounding the shooting may continue to grow, leaving many questions unanswered. Either way, the trial represents a turning point. For the first time since that night in September 1996, the story behind one of music's most shocking tragedies will be examined not through rumors or interviews, but through the formal process of justice.
So these are fluorescent lights.
Yeah.
And you're sleeping in that light. What was the first night there?
First night was very intense. Again, I'm, coming down off drugs, and by that time, the second time I went in, between the 2 times I got.
That possibility is exactly what the defense appears to be counting on. The indictment issued on September 28, 2023, does not rely on a surprise witness suddenly appearing with new information. It does not revolve around secret surveillance footage that investigators recently uncovered. Instead, the prosecution's case leans heavily on the defendant's own words. Over the years, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis described the events surrounding the death of Tupac Shakur in interviews, television appearances, and perhaps most notably in his 2019 memoir, Compton Street Legend. In those accounts, Davis did not present himself as someone guessing about events. He placed himself directly inside the white Cadillac that allegedly carried the shooters. He described the weapon involved, a Glock .40 caliber pistol, and explained where it had been stored in the car. He talked about the seating arrangement, even mentioning the armrest compartment where the gun was supposedly kept. these were not hesitant statements. They were detailed descriptions delivered with confidence. Prosecutors did not need to pressure him during an interrogation to produce those details. He offered them voluntarily, repeatedly, and often in public settings. According to law enforcement officials, renewed interest in his statements began around 2018 when his interviews started circulating widely online. Investigators began examining those comments more carefully, recognizing that they were coming from someone who appeared eager to tell his version of events. This distinction matters in a courtroom. The narrative is not about a suspect being cornered during questioning and eventually making an admission. Instead, it involves a man who spent years publicly repeating the story himself. He spoke about it during media appearances, participated in documentaries, and ultimately published it in a book that presented his perspective in vivid detail. What once seemed like a bold attempt to shape his legacy now forms the backbone of a homicide case. As the trial approaches, those same statements are being transformed into exhibits. Words that once enhanced Davis's reputation on the street are now being examined line by prosecutors and defense attorneys. People close to the investigation say the shift in his tone is impossible to ignore. The earlier version of the story sounded confident, almost proud. The new version sounds defensive, emphasizing exaggeration and misunderstanding. The simplified explanation offered publicly has long been clear. On September 7, 1996, security cameras at the MGM Grand captured an altercation involving Tupac Shakur and Orlando Anderson. The confrontation occurred just hours before the fatal drive-by shooting on the Las Vegas Strip. Many investigators have argued that the attack was simply an act of retaliation for that earlier fight. But Davis's own stories complicate that explanation. While he acknowledged the casino incident, he also described discussions involving money, influence, and larger rivalries within the music industry. By introducing those elements, he transformed what could have been interpreted as a personal street conflict into something that sounded much more organized and transactional. And that shift raises an uncomfortable question for both sides in the courtroom. If the shooting was purely revenge for a fight earlier that night, why do Davis's own descriptions repeatedly introduce business motives and financial incentives?
City, we are hearing Diddy's attorneys speaking to the media after he was sentenced earlier today. This is live.
Yeah, we are planning to appeal.
Man, I want to hear them, bro.
We are planning to appeal. We think we have strong.
As the legal battle moves closer to trial, the defense strategy surrounding Dwayne Keefe D. Davis is becoming clearer. His lawyers are attempting to challenge the prosecution's most powerful weapon, his own past statements. For years, Davis openly discussed the events surrounding the killing of Tupac Shakur in interviews, podcasts, and his memoir Compton Street Legend. Those stories helped turn him into one of the most controversial figures connected to the case. But once prosecutors used those statements to charge him with murder in 2023, the same words suddenly became a legal threat rather than a personal narrative. The defense is now trying to convince the court that Davis believed he had a form of protection when he told those stories publicly. According to his attorneys, Davis cooperated with law enforcement years ago under the assumption that certain information he provided would not later be used against him in court. This argument focuses on earlier meetings Davis had with investigators in which he reportedly spoke about the events surrounding the shooting. If the defense can successfully argue that those statements were protected by a cooperation agreement, a large portion of the prosecution's case could weaken dramatically. Without Davis's own words, investigators would need to rely more heavily on physical evidence and witness testimony from nearly 3 decades ago, something that becomes increasingly difficult as time passes. Another complication lies in the credibility of Davis himself. Prosecutors are expected to argue that he repeatedly described the shooting voluntarily and publicly long after those earlier law enforcement conversations took place. They will likely claim that those later interviews were not protected because they were given freely to journalists, documentary filmmakers, and writers. This clash between two interpretations, confession versus storytelling, may ultimately shape the entire trial. The prosecution will attempt to show that Davis consistently described the same core events across different platforms. The defense, however, will try to show that he exaggerated details over time, turning fragments of truth into dramatic narratives designed to attract attention and sell books. If jurors believe the defense's explanation, the case becomes far more complicated. A man who built his reputation on telling a shocking story would suddenly be arguing that those same words were never meant to be taken literally. And that raises a deeper question that may linger over the entire courtroom. When someone repeats the same story for decades, does it become evidence or just a legend repeated too many times?
Day 17 in the Diddy trial as the biggest one yet. Guess what? Bingo, you won, because today was probably the most eventful day as far as things that happened that were said on the stand, and most importantly, things that the judge said, because Diddy almost got kicked out of his
The man who once publicly claimed he was sitting inside the car during one of hip-hop's most infamous nights is now insisting that those statements were never meant to be taken literally. For years, the public viewed Dwayne Keefe D. Davis as the outspoken eyewitness who seemed to have already explained exactly how Tupac Shakur was killed in 1996. His stories circulated for decades through interviews, documentaries, and podcasts. Many listeners believed they were hearing the closest thing to a first-hand account of the shooting that shocked the music world. But everything changed once those same words stopped being entertainment and started being treated as evidence in a criminal case. When a Nevada grand jury turned those public statements into a formal indictment, the narrative flipped almost overnight. Suddenly, the man who once spoke confidently about the events of that night began describing those stories as exaggerated and misunderstood. According to new legal arguments from his defense team, Davis is now claiming that his past confessions were not literal admissions of guilt, but rather dramatized storytelling. The explanation he offers is simple but controversial. He believed he was protected when he spoke publicly about the case. That claim is now spreading quickly through legal circles and media coverage. Davis's attorneys are attempting to bring another powerful figure into the courtroom, Sean "Diddy" Combs. Their strategy centers on forcing Combs to testify under oath, arguing that Davis's earlier accounts included exaggerated elements connected to rumors about money and motives within the music industry. By doing so, they hope to demonstrate that some of the most explosive details were never meant to be treated as factual confessions. The complication is that Davis's earlier stories were extremely detailed. In his 2019 memoir, Compton Street Legend, he described the white Cadillac that allegedly carried the shooters. He talked about the weapon, a Glock pistol. He explained where people were sitting inside the car. He even referenced a rumored $1 million bounty that had allegedly been discussed behind the scenes. These were not vague suggestions. They were presented with striking specificity, almost like scenes from a crime drama being retold by someone who had witnessed them firsthand. Then came the turning point. In September 2023, Davis was formally charged in connection with the murder of Tupac Shakur. The legal stakes instantly transformed his old interviews from sensational storytelling into potential courtroom evidence. Meanwhile, another unexpected development unfolded in a completely separate case. In July 2025, Sean Combs received a 50-month federal prison sentence related to unrelated legal charges. That conviction created a new context for the defense strategy now unfolding. The central question suddenly becomes unavoidable. If Davis's earlier accounts were fictional exaggerations, how did they manage to include such precise details? And if those stories were actually true, why attempt to walk them back now that they are being examined under oath? The answer may come down to one simple reality. If Sean Combs is eventually required to testify in court about those allegations, the consequences could be enormous. Because once the truth is tested under oath, either Davis's credibility collapses or the entire story becomes much bigger than anyone expected.
Diddy named Diddy 77 times in court documents related to Tupac.
In earlier interviews and in the pages of Compton Street Legend, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis described a conversation that he claimed involved Sean "Diddy" Combs. According to that account, fear of Suge Knight was a major factor driving tension within the music industry at the time. The story suggested that powerful figures on the East Coast were concerned about the influence Knight held through Death Row Records and the alliances surrounding Tupac Shakur. Davis claimed that during this period, discussions took place about a $1 million payment for eliminating the perceived threat. In his version of events, this alleged offer was tied to the broader rivalry that had come to define the East Coast versus West Coast feud during the mid-1990s. According to the story, the meeting where these conversations supposedly occurred took place at a well-known Los Angeles deli called Greenblatt's. By presenting the story in that way, Davis framed the shooting not as an impulsive reaction to a street fight, but as something closer to a business decision. He even wrote that after the shooting occurred, the promised money never actually arrived. That detail raises obvious questions today. If the bounty was real, where did the payment go? And if it was fictional, why repeat the same figure so consistently across multiple interviews and written accounts? Industry insiders have long debated that detail. Some believe the $1 million figure sounds too precise to be random, yet also suspiciously round, as if it were designed to sound dramatic. Regardless of which interpretation is correct, the number itself has become central to the legal strategy unfolding today. The defense now wants Sean "Diddy" Combs to appear in a Nevada courtroom and address those claims under oath. That request is not simply a routine attempt to call a witness. It is a high-risk legal maneuver that could reshape the case entirely. If Combs testifies and firmly denies that any such bounty was ever discussed, Davis's defense team may argue that his earlier statements were exaggerated storytelling designed to enhance his reputation. But if even a small portion of the narrative is confirmed, the implications could extend far beyond the current indictment. Instead of focusing solely on the individuals in the white Cadillac that night, the trial could begin exploring whether powerful figures within the music industry played indirect roles in shaping the circumstances surrounding the killing. In other words, what began as a case centered on a single shooting could evolve into a much larger examination of the rivalries, fears, and business pressures that defined hip-hop during the 1990s. As preparations for trial continue, the legal focus surrounding Dwayne Keefe D. Davis is shifting toward one crucial issue: credibility. For years, Davis positioned himself as someone who knew exactly what happened the night Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas. He spoke confidently in interviews, appeared in documentaries, and eventually documented his version of events in his memoir Compton Street Legend. Those statements shaped public perception of the case and made Davis one of the most controversial figures linked to the investigation. Now those same statements are being placed under intense legal scrutiny. Prosecutors plan to analyze them line by line, comparing the details he shared publicly with the evidence gathered by investigators over the years. The prosecution's strategy is straightforward. If Davis repeatedly described the same events in multiple settings, jurors may view those statements as admissions rather than entertainment. The defense, however, intends to attack that logic. According to Davis's attorneys, the stories he told over the years were influenced by street culture, reputation, and the storytelling traditions common in hip-hop communities. In their argument, exaggeration and bravado are not unusual when individuals recount events connected to gang conflicts or industry rivalries. They suggest that Davis's public persona may have encouraged him to make claims that sounded dramatic, even if they were not entirely accurate. Another layer of complexity comes from the passage of time. The statements Davis made in interviews often occurred many years after the events of September 1996. Human memory is not perfect, and people sometimes mix rumor with personal experience when recalling events from decades earlier. Defense attorneys may argue that the prosecution is relying on memories that have been reshaped by years of public discussion, documentaries, and media speculation. Jurors will likely hear recordings of those interviews, read excerpts from Davis's book, and examine transcripts of earlier conversations with investigators. Each statement will be compared carefully with the evidence surrounding the night Shakur was shot. Ultimately, the courtroom may face a fundamental question. When someone repeatedly tells a story about a crime for decades, does that repetition make the story more believable, or does it simply make the legend stronger?